as Prophet Jeremiah reached for her once more, his lips curling with sinful desire, Grace smiled, because this time, she was the one holding the power and his fate. If you are enjoying this gripping tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more intense stories on sacred tales of fate. The massive church auditorium was filled beyond capacity, the air thick with the scent of perfume, sweat, and the palpable anticipation of the miraculous. Thousands had gathered, pressing against each other in the dim glow of chandeliers and neon lights that lined the grand stage. The voices of the choir rose in a crescendo, their harmonies intertwining with the deep bass of the drums and the wail of the electric guitar. Hands were lifted, eyes tightly shut, lips quivering with whispered prayers. Hope hung heavy in the air, mingling with the scent of exotic colognes and the faint metallic tang of desperation. At the center of it all stood Prophet Jeremiah Adewale, the man of the moment, the anointed vessel of God, the spiritual father to millions. He was draped in a flowing white agbada, the fabric crisp and untouched by the heat of the congregation. The golden embroidery shimmered under the stage lights, adding an ethereal glow to his already magnetic presence. His face was smooth, untouched by worry, his eyes sharp and penetrating as they swept over the sea of worshippers. He held the microphone loosely in his hand, his thumb lightly tapping against its body as he prepared to speak. The moment he opened his mouth, the crowd erupted in shouts of joy and praise. "Papa, speak to us," they cried. Some fell to their knees, others lifted their hands toward him as if trying to catch an invisible outpouring of divine power. He lifted a single hand, and the noise ebbed into an expectant silence. Tonight, his voice rolled over the congregation, rich and commanding, "Is your night of divine visitation." A roar of hallelujahs followed. He smiled, his perfect teeth gleaming under the bright lights. "The Lord has spoken to me, and he has sent me to tell you, your suffering is over." The auditorium quaked with frenzied response. Women wept with joy, their hands clasped over their chests. Men pumped their fists into the air, their voices raw from shouting. Those who had come in wheelchairs struggled to stand, driven by faith and desperation. The sick, the barren, the broken, they all held onto his words like a lifeline. The very air pulsed with their belief in the miracles they had come to witness. Cameras panned across the room, capturing the sea of faces contorted with emotion. The live broadcast was already reaching millions across the world, flooding social media platforms, television screens, and radio stations. The prophet's message traveled far beyond the four walls of the church, touching homes, offices, and hospital rooms. His reach was unparalleled. The testimonies that followed were nothing short of astounding. A woman, once crippled, now walked unassisted to the stage, tears streaming down her face. "I came here on crutches," she sobbed, "but as Papa prayed, I felt a fire in my legs, the pain disappeared, and now look at me. I can walk." The crowd exploded into praise, some rushing forward to touch the hem of Prophet Jeremiah's agbada. Another man, who had allegedly been jobless for years, ran onto the stage, waving a crisp employment letter. "I applied months ago," he shouted breathlessly, "and they kept rejecting me. But yesterday, after sowing my seed of faith, I got the job." The euphoria was electrifying. People fell to the floor in worship, tongues rolling off their lips in an unbroken symphony of gratitude. Prophet Jeremiah smiled, raising his hands once more. "My children, the Lord is here. If he has done it for them, he will do it for you." His words sent another ripple of hysteria through the congregation. The church's offering baskets were already overflowing as people rushed forward, desperate to plant their own seeds of faith. He had built an empire on this faith, a kingdom that stretched far beyond the walls of his ministry. Prophet Jeremiah Adewale was not just a man of God, he was a brand, a global phenomenon. His name graced billboards, his face adorned books and posters, He owned luxury cars, sleek, expensive machines that purred like tame beasts beneath his fingers. His homes were mansions, sprawling estates in the most elite neighborhoods. His private schools educated the children of the wealthy, and his businesses flourished under the banner of divine favor. Yet, behind the carefully curated image of holiness, behind the grand sermons and public miracles, there existed a darkness that only a few knew about, a hunger, insatiable and carefully hidden. Prophet Jeremiah Adewale was a man with secrets. To the world, he was a prophet. To some, he was a savior, but to the women who sought his spiritual guidance, he was something else entirely. A shepherd who feasted on his flock, a man whose hands, raised in blessing before thousands, often traced forbidden paths in the shadows. And on this particular night, as the service raged on and the faithful poured their souls onto the altar, Prophet Jeremiah's sharp eyes scanned the congregation. Somewhere in that sea of believers, he had already chosen his next conquest. Among the countless worshippers who knelt before him seeking divine intervention was Grace Omotayo, a devout follower who had recently lost her job and was struggling with depression. Desperate for answers, she sought out a private counseling session with the prophet, hoping for prayers that would change her fate. Inside his lavishly furnished office, the air was eerily still. A giant golden frame picture of him hung behind his desk, and the scent of burning incense filled the room. The walls were lined with bookshelves holding thick, leather-bound Bibles and religious texts. A golden cross gleamed under the dim lighting. "My daughter, the Lord reveals that you have been under a great spiritual attack," Prophet Jeremiah said, his voice laced with authority. "But do not be afraid. The Lord has given me the power to break every yoke in your life." Tears streamed down Grace's face as she clasped her hands together. "Please, man of God, I will do whatever it takes." The prophet's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he stood and approached her, his agbada billowing slightly as he moved. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Faith is the key to deliverance, my daughter. The stronger your faith, the faster your breakthrough will come." Grace nodded fervently. She had heard the testimonies, seen the miracles. If there was even the smallest chance that the prophet could help her, she was willing to do anything. "Your suffering is not of this world. Dark forces have conspired against you," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But God has given me the power to intercede on your behalf. Through prayer and faith, you shall be restored." Grace's sobs grew louder. She had been carrying the burden of job loss, loneliness, and despair for too long. The prophet's words were like a balm to her wounded spirit. "Now we must pray together," he declared. "Kneel with me, my daughter." She obeyed instantly, lowering herself onto the thick Persian rug that covered the floor. The prophet knelt beside her, his hands lifting toward the heavens. His voice, deep and commanding, filled the room as he began to pray. The words rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, a mesmerizing cadence that sent shivers down Grace's spine. As the prayer intensified, the incense in the room seemed to thicken, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. Grace's eyes fluttered shut as she let herself be consumed by the moment, clinging to the hope that deliverance was near. But then, something shifted. The prophet's voice softened, the words slower, more deliberate. His hand, once resting lightly on her shoulder, now moved downward. Grace stiffened, confusion flickering across her features. "You must surrender completely to receive your breakthrough, my daughter," he murmured. A sliver of doubt wedged itself into Grace's mind, but she quickly pushed it away. This was the prophet, the anointed man of God. He had helped so many before her. Surely he knew what he was doing. But as his touch lingered, doubt turned to fear. Something was wrong. Her heart pounded, her breath shallow. She willed herself to move, to speak, but her body refused to cooperate. And in that moment, the weight of her faith and fear collided, trapping her between the promise of salvation and the darkness that loomed just beyond the prophet's reassuring smile. A slow, knowing smile crept onto his lips. He rose from his chair and walked towards her, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. His fingers lingered too long, his touch neither fatherly nor godly. "This battle requires special anointing," he murmured, his fingers tightening. "I must lay hands on you personally. The Lord has chosen you for a special deliverance." Something in his eyes unsettled her, but she was too desperate to protest. She had heard stories of women being taken into his private chambers for special prayers, but she never believed them until now. That night, he took what was not his to take. Grace left the church that evening a different woman, broken and tainted. The prayer she had hoped for had turned into a nightmare she could not escape, and like many before her, she remained silent, shackled by fear, shame, and the belief that no one would believe her word against that of a revered man of God. The once sacred space of worship had become a prison of trauma, its towering walls now suffocating rather than comforting. Every Sunday she sat in the pews, her eyes downcast, her spirit crushed. The choir's songs of praise rang hollow in her ears, and the words of the prophet that once inspired her now felt like chains tightening around her soul. But the weight of silence grew heavier with each passing day. She watched as more women sought the same prayers, the same counsel, unaware of the darkness lurking behind closed doors. The whispered rumors that once seemed like distant echoes were now her reality, and she could no longer ignore the truth. One evening, as she sat alone in her small apartment, the dim glow of a single candle illuminating the room, she made a decision. She would not be silent any longer. She picked up her phone, her hands trembling, and dialed a number she had been too afraid to call before. "Hello?" A voice on the other end answered. Grace took a deep breath. "I need to tell you what happened to me." The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to reclaim her voice and her truth. The days that followed were filled with anxiety. Grace had confided in an old friend, one who had always been skeptical of Prophet Jeremiah. At first, the words had been difficult to form, her voice breaking as she relived the horror of that night. But as the story poured out, her friend listened, her eyes dark with understanding and quiet rage. "You can't let this go," her friend said firmly. "You're not the only one." The realization settled like a stone in Grace's chest. How many others had been victims of the prophet's so-called special anointing? How many women sat in silence, trapped in shame and fear, just as she had? The thought ignited something in her, a slow, simmering resolve. She began her search, reaching out anonymously in online forums and social media groups where church members gathered. It wasn't long before whispers turned into confessions. Other women began to share their experiences, their words like echoes of her own pain. Some spoke in riddles, too afraid to say his name outright, but Grace understood. They were just like her. Weeks passed, and what had started as a personal search for justice turned into a movement. More women came forward, their voices gaining strength. A journalist from a local news outlet got wind of the story and reached out to Grace. At first, she hesitated. The thought of exposing herself, of having her trauma scrutinized by the public, was terrifying. But the prophet had thrived in darkness for too long. It was time for the truth to come to light. She agreed to meet with the journalist. In a quiet cafe tucked away from prying eyes, she recounted everything in painstaking detail. The journalist took notes, recording every word, ensuring that no part of her story would be lost. When they parted ways, Grace felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had taken the first step towards justice. The article was published days later. It was explosive. The once revered prophet Jeremiah was suddenly at the center of a scandal that rocked the nation. His followers were divided. Some stood by him, declaring it a malicious attack from the devil, while others began to question the man they had once worshipped. More victims came forward, their stories adding fuel to the fire. The authorities launched an investigation. The church issued a statement denying all allegations, calling it a campaign to destroy God's work. Prophet Jeremiah himself appeared on a televised broadcast, his voice trembling with emotion as he claimed innocence. He warned his followers of wolves in sheep's clothing, of those sent to tear down the kingdom of God. But the damage had been done. Grace watched the broadcast from her apartment, her hands clenched into fists. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be those who would call her a liar, who would try to discredit her. But she also knew she was not alone anymore. The battle had begun, and she was ready to fight. Grace stood in the sterile room, the white walls suffocating her as she gripped the crumpled test results in her hands. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting an almost eerie glow on her tear-streaked face. The doctor's words echoed in her mind, a dull, unyielding thud. HIV positive? It felt like a punch to the gut, the weight of it sinking deep into her chest. She had always believed that nothing could hurt more than the day the prophet had first touched her. That first moment when everything she had known to be pure and holy had been ripped away. But now, this was worse. This was real, undeniable. A permanent mark on her body, a consequence of the choices she had made. The consequence of trusting a man she had thought was sent by God. The memory of the prophet's hands on her, his whispered promises in her ear, came rushing back. He had been so convincing, so sure of his righteousness. His words had been so smooth, so intoxicating. He had told her that he was doing the Lord's work, that he was purging her of the sins she carried, that this was all part of God's divine plan for her life. He had made her believe it, had made her believe that she was chosen for something greater, that she had to endure this, to cleanse herself. She had trusted him, her faith completely surrendered to his guidance. But now here she was, alone, broken, infected. Grace walked out of the clinic, her head spinning, her vision blurred by both the tears and the storm of thoughts crashing inside her. The streets of Lagos seemed to blur in a haze of neon lights, the thumping bass of music from nearby clubs pounding in her chest. She stumbled, not caring where she was going, not caring about anything anymore. All she could think of was how to make him pay. The world around her had lost its meaning. The promises of happiness she had once chased in the throes of her reckless nights now seemed hollow. She had thought that burying her pain in alcohol, in the bodies of men who didn't know her name, would dull the ache inside her, but it hadn't. It had only deepened the void. She had tried so hard to forget, to escape, but now the truth was undeniable, written on her body in a way that no party, no drink, no lover could ever erase. And as the rage began to well up inside her, she knew what she had to do. Prophet Jeremiah Adewale was not untouchable. He was not a god. He was a man who had used his position to exploit others, to twist their faith, to tear apart lives in the name of salvation. Grace had seen the way he manipulated those who came to him, the way he made them feel special, chosen, as though they were the only ones who mattered. She had been one of many, a pawn in his game, and now she would be the one to take him down. The idea consumed her. In the weeks that followed, Grace began to plot. She had lost so much already, her health, her dignity, her future. But this was something she could control. She would make him pay for what he had done to her, to all the others whose lives he had wrecked with his lies and his false promises. She would expose him for what he truly was, a fraud, a predator hiding behind the guise of a prophet. But revenge was a dangerous path to walk. Grace knew that the people who followed the prophet were blind to his faults, that they believed in him with the kind of devotion she had once shared. They would fight to protect him, to defend the illusion he had created. And yet, the thought of standing by doing nothing was unbearable. She would have to be clever. She would have to be patient. Grace began to gather information, using her connections from her old life, from the parties she still frequented, from the whispers of the city. There were others like her, people who had fallen prey to the prophet's charms, people who had been discarded once their usefulness had run its course. She found them one by one, in the dark corners of Lagos, in the places where secrets festered and truths were hidden. They were broken, disillusioned, some of them lost to drugs or alcohol, some of them too ashamed to even speak of their encounters with him. But slowly, they began to talk. Slowly, they began to trust her, to share their stories. And each story fueled her resolve. The prophet's hold on the city was vast, but not unshakable. Grace could see the cracks now, the signs of his own growing desperation. She watched as he preached his sermons with increasing fervor, his eyes wild with the need for validation. She saw the way he treated his followers, those who could still give him something, like possessions, and those who could no longer be of use to him, like dirt beneath his feet. It was only a matter of time before he would slip, and when he did, Grace would be there, ready to make sure he paid for the destruction he had caused. Her path was set, her heart hardened. She was no longer the naive, devout girl she had been. The world had stripped that away from her, and in its place, a new fire had been kindled. This fire would not burn out until Prophet Jeremiah Adewale had been brought to his knees. Grace had nothing left to lose, and that, she realized, was the most dangerous weapon of all. Grace's return to the prophet's services was deliberate, calculated, and far from the naive devotion she had once exhibited. She no longer stood in awe of his every word, his every gesture. Now, she stood with the eyes of a hunter, biding her time and waiting for the moment when she could strike. Each service felt like a performance, a play, in which she had rehearsed every movement, every glance, every word. The prophet had not noticed her return at first. She had made herself a shadow, a figure who blended into the sea of faithful worshippers, her presence quiet, unobtrusive. But she knew that it would only be a matter of time before he saw her, the lost lamb returning to the fold, the one who had once been so devoted. And when he did notice, he would fall back into his pattern of manipulation. She knew that he would think he could charm her once again, that he could lure her back into his grasp with his words, his promises. Grace could already hear him, his voice smooth like honey, promising her redemption, just as he had done before. But this time, she would not be swayed. This time, she would be the one controlling the narrative. The first few weeks were the hardest. She had to sit through his sermons of salvation and divine power, and pretend that she believed in his lies. She had to hold her tongue when the faithful around her gasped in awe of his words, when they cried out in what they thought was worship. But the truth was, the only thing Grace was worshiping now was the idea of revenge. The kind that would be so perfect, so calculated, it would bring him to his knees in a way that he could never recover from. The more she listened, the more the walls of the prophet's facade began to crumble. She saw the cracks, the inconsistencies in his teachings, the hollow way in which he spoke of love and compassion while using his power to manipulate and control. The stories of his other victims, women who had been discarded once their usefulness had ended, only served to fuel her fury. Each story, each new whisper, confirmed what she already knew. The prophet was nothing more than a predator hiding behind the veil of piety. And yet, despite all of this, Grace knew she had to play the game. She had to allow herself to be drawn in, to let him believe that he still had control over her. This wasn't just about her. This was about every woman he had ruined, every life he had shattered in the name of God. She would make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. It wasn't long before the prophet noticed her again. It started with small gestures, a glance in her direction during a sermon, a question after the service about how she was doing, about whether she had found her way back to the Lord. He was subtle at first, cautious, sensing something different in her eyes, something that wasn't quite the same as the eager devotion she had once shown him. But Grace smiled, feigned innocence, and played along. "You've been missed," he told her one evening after service, his hand lingering on her shoulder in what he thought was a casual, fatherly gesture. "God has a plan for you, my dear. I can see it in your eyes. You've come back for a reason." Grace nodded, her eyes lowered in feigned humility. "I've come to learn, prophet," she whispered, "to be closer to God. His smile deepened, and in his eyes she saw the same look he had given so many others, possessive, greedy. The look of a man who believed that he could do anything, take anything, in the name of God. "You're on the right path," he said, his voice low, intimate. "We'll speak soon. There's much we can discuss." Grace's heart didn't race with excitement or fear, but with calculation. She knew what he wanted, she knew how he worked, and she knew that the longer she played the part, the closer she would get to him. The prophet began inviting her into his private sessions again, one-on-one meetings that he reserved for the most devoted of his followers. Grace had been here before, in the shadowed corners of his chambers, where the walls seemed to hum with the weight of his power, where his words flowed like a river of promises. But now, she was not the innocent, desperate girl who had once looked up at him in awe. Now, she was the predator, and he, the prey. Each meeting grew more intimate, more manipulative. The prophet would speak of the Lord's work, his hands often lingering too long on her arm, his voice slipping into a tone of false tenderness that made Grace's skin crawl. She resisted the urge to recoil, to push him away. She knew that the more he believed in his power over her, the closer she would be to the moment when everything would fall apart for him. And then the time came. One evening, after another of his preachings about faith and salvation, he invited her to his chambers once more. This time, Grace was ready. She had spent days preparing, studying every move, every word, every gesture he might make. She knew how he would act, what he would say, and she was prepared to turn it all back on him. As she walked into his private quarters, the air felt thick, charged. She could sense his anticipation, could feel his eyes on her, hungry and possessive. He motioned for her to sit, his smile wide, expectant. "Grace," he said, his voice low and inviting, "you've come back to me. I knew it was only a matter of time. You're ready now, aren't you?" Grace met his gaze, her expression soft, but inside, her heart was a storm. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change. She could feel the weight of the years of hurt, the years of betrayal, the years of pain, all leading up to this. It had taken time, but she had become someone stronger, someone willing to do whatever it took to make him pay. "Ready?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. And in that moment, she knew that everything was in her control. The prophet had fallen right into her trap. Now she would make him pay, not just for the pain he had caused her, but for the destruction he had left in his wake. The news spread like wildfire through the congregation. The once venerated prophet, whose very presence had once commanded awe, was now facing a fate he had imposed on others. His followers, who had once hung on every word he spoke, found themselves in a whirlwind of disbelief and confusion. How could this happen? How could their prophet, the man they had trusted to guide them, to heal them, be infected with the very disease he had used as a weapon? At first, some of his closest allies tried to maintain the illusion. They clung to the belief that this was just another trial, another test from God to purify him, to bring him closer to his divine plan. They told the congregation that the prophet's suffering was a sign of his righteousness, that God was allowing him to endure in order to elevate the faithful. But as the prophet's condition worsened, the whispers grew louder. His face, once full of the fervor of a man on a divine mission, had become a shadow of itself, haggard, gaunt, and pale. His hands, which had once reached out to heal others, now trembled uncontrollably. The vibrant energy he had exuded during his sermons had been replaced by a deep, exhausting weakness. It was impossible to ignore now. The signs were everywhere. Grace watched from the shadows, her heart cold with satisfaction as the prophet's empire began to crumble around him. She had not intended for his illness to spread so quickly, but in a way, she found herself pleased by how swiftly the punishment was taking hold. She had been the one to inflict the disease upon him, the one who had planted the seed of his undoing, and now it was taking root in ways she couldn't have imagined. As the prophet's followers began to question him, some turned away, their faith shattered by the revelation of his illness. How could they believe in a man who could not even protect himself from the very plague he had preached against? For some, the reality was too much to bear. The walls of his kingdom were slowly crumbling, brick by brick, as doubt and fear crept in. The prophet, in his desperation, tried to maintain control. He surrounded himself with those who still believed in his divine purpose, those who swore that his illness was a temporary setback. But even his most loyal followers could not ignore the truth forever. The rumors were growing louder, whispers of his reckless behavior, of his manipulation of his followers, of the countless women he had exploited in the name of God. The truth was no longer something that could be hidden away. And then came the inevitable moment. The one Grace had known was coming. The prophet, now a shell of the powerful man he had once been, stood before his congregation, a hollow figure of his former self. His voice, barely audible, broke as he tried to address the people who had once worshipped him. "My children," he croaked, his eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and pride. "I stand before you not as a perfect man, but as a servant of the Lord. What I endure is but a test of faith. I ask you, do not falter, do not lose hope in the divine mission that we are a part of." The crowd, once fervently devoted, now looked on with uncertainty. Some wept for the man they had once believed was chosen by God, while others exchanged wary glances, unsure of what to think. Grace was among them, her expression unreadable, her mind focused only on the fact that the prophet's reign was coming to an end. In the days that followed, the prophet's condition deteriorated rapidly. He could no longer make public appearances, his health failing so quickly that even his closest supporters began to question his claims. There were murmurs of resignation, and whispers of his past sins began to surface. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling, and the man who had once held the city in his grasp was now a prisoner to his own body. And Grace, who had watched this all unfold from the sidelines, knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light. She had done what she set out to do, and now, with the prophet's suffering on full display, she knew that the justice she had longed for was finally within reach. The prophet's illness would be his undoing, but it was the revelation of his sins that would truly destroy him. His empire would crumble under the weight of his own actions, and the people who had once followed him blindly would have no choice but to face the truth. His name would be tarnished forever, and the legacy he had built on manipulation and lies would be reduced to nothing. As the prophet's body weakened, so too did his influence. The faithful scattered, and the once glorious temple that had been the symbol of his power stood empty, a shell of its former self. Grace, however, stood strong in her resolve. The prophet had been brought low, but there was more work to be done. The women who had suffered at his hands still needed justice, still needed their voices heard. In the end, the prophet's greatest downfall had not been the disease that had ravaged his body. It had been the truth, because the truth always has a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it is buried. And Grace had made sure that the truth would be his undoing. The city of Lagos, once a place of blind worship and unshakable faith in the prophet's power, would never be the same again. The prophet's world collapsed in on itself as swiftly as it had risen. His vast influence, once unshakable, began to disintegrate under the weight of truth. The women he had preyed upon, those he had abused and discarded, each had a story, and now they were telling them. The floodgates of silence had opened, and with it a damning chorus of testimonies filled the air. Their pain, once buried, was now broadcast for all to hear. Lawsuits piled up, each one a nail in the coffin of his reputation. The very men who had once looked up to him as a leader, as a spiritual guide, now distanced themselves from him, their loyalty torn apart by the atrocities he had committed. The church, once an institution of unquestioned power, became a place of shame and guilt. His once adoring followers, who had given him their time, their money, their faith, now burned his photographs in the streets. They spoke of him with venom, their devotion having morphed into disgust. Journalists, hungry for a story, swarmed his mansion. The doors that had once been open to the faithful were now barricaded against the outside world. His mansion, once a symbol of divine success, now stood as a crumbling monument to his deceit. Inside, the prophet's once grand estate felt cold and empty, its hollow rooms echoing with the ghosts of the lies he had lived by. The government, seizing the opportunity, froze his accounts. His wealth, accumulated through manipulation and lies, now lay beyond his reach. The wealth he had flaunted so baldly was stripped from him in a matter of days. Without his riches, without his power, the prophet had no more influence. The sanctuary he had built for himself turned into a prison of his own making. And then the world witnessed the ultimate betrayal. His family, once by his side, now fled the country. They could no longer endure the shame of being associated with him. They scattered like leaves in the wind, seeking refuge in places far from the scandal that had engulfed their lives. His wife, who had once stood proudly beside him, now was nowhere to be found. His children, too young to understand the depth of the damage, were hidden away from the eyes of the world. The prophet had been abandoned by those who once called him family, left alone in the very house he had built from the broken trust of others. Grace, the quiet architect of his destruction, watched from the shadows. She had given him the fate he had so callously imposed on countless others. And with that, a strange sense of satisfaction washed over her. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, real justice. The world had witnessed his fall, but it was her hand that had guided him to the precipice, and it was her resolve that had pushed him over the edge. She had stripped him of his power, taken from him the very thing that had defined his existence, control. She had watched him unravel, piece by piece, until he was nothing but a broken man, a mere shell of the image he had once projected. The power he had abused so recklessly had been the thing that ultimately destroyed him. Grace had become both judge and executioner, and the taste of her victory was bittersweet. The shepherd had become the prey. The once mighty man who had twisted faith for his own desires now found himself at the mercy of a world he had deceived. His name would never be remembered with reverence again. The legacy he had built would be reduced to nothing but whispers of scandal and betrayal. In the end, he had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of living a lie. As Grace walked away from the crumbling ruins of the prophet's empire, she whispered under her breath, "Justice has been served." It wasn't just his downfall that gave her peace. It was the realization that she had reclaimed the agency that had once been stolen from her. For too long, she had lived in the shadow of his manipulation, her life dictated by his cruelty. But now, she had taken control. She had rewritten the narrative, and in doing so, she had found a form of redemption that no preacher, no savior, no institution could ever offer. And the streets of Lagos, once a place of pain and lost faith, now felt different to her. They were no longer a symbol of the darkness she had endured, but a testament to her strength. The night was still alive with the sounds of the city. Cars honking, people laughing, music spilling out of the clubs. But for Grace, the noise had faded into the background. What mattered now was the silence she had earned, the peace she had fought for. Her journey wasn't over, but it had come to a close in this chapter. The prophet's reign had ended, and with it, Grace had freed herself from the chains of her past. She wasn't the woman she had once been. Broken, lost, searching for answers. She had found her own justice, her own redemption, and in doing so, had become a force to be reckoned with. The world had learned a harsh lesson. Power, when abused, would always come to an end. And for Grace, the final chapter of her own story had been written not in the ruins of a corrupt empire, but in the quiet strength of her own survival. What are your thoughts on this video? Kindly drop them in the comment section. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification button, as your support really means a lot to us. Stay tuned.